every kind invite the crowd.
We'll begin with what could be the rumblings of yet another major event.
Those that make us grip our seats with excitement.
Major breaking news tonight. An explosive report about...
And hoopla it surely is.
There's a bunch going on tonight. A lot of news has broken in the last 24 hours, so let's get right to it.
A sample of the marvelous tricks you'll see for the price of a small thin dime. You get the whole show now if you hurry, hurry, hurry!
Hello everyone and welcome to the Circus. I'm Anthony Rotolo and I'll be your ringmaster for this week's look at the stories taking center stage in that big top of broadcasting, that freak show of fake news, that carnival of commentating clowns, also known as the mainstream media. This week, like most weeks, we are starting out with a media spectacle unlike any seen before, as this week's news was dominated by a story of palace intrigue. That's a term we've been hearing a lot on the cable news channels especially, as they talk about their reporting in reference to the inside dealings, backstabbing, and front stabbing taking place on the White House staff. In fact, this story was summed up best this week by a New York Post cover that depicted the members of the Trump administration as contestants on the reality show Survivor. And that has attracted the attention of the mainstream media so strongly that it's even taken precedence over the Russia story, something I personally didn't think would happen for some time to come. So what is it that's taken their attention away from Mother Russia? What shiny object could possibly be so interesting that the end of the Republic as we know it, the secret takeover by the communists, could be displaced in the headlines? Well, you see, at the beginning of the week, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer resigned.
We begin with that shakeup at the White House. Sean Spicer is out, resigning after 6 months on the job. Seen today outside the old executive office building, our correspondent was inside the West Wing as this drama was unfolding.
Sean Spicer has been the focus of a lot of attention since Trump took office, most notably from Saturday Night Live and Melissa McCarthy's portrayal of him as her character Spicy, which pretty much everyone has to admit is pretty brilliant.
In the sense of Rocky the movie, because I came out here to punch you in the face, and also I don't talk so good. Now I'd like to begin today by apologizing on behalf of you to me for how you have treated me these last 2 weeks. And that apology is not accepted, because I'm not here to be your buddy. I'm here to swallow gum, and I'm here to take names.
And Spicer has done his best at his post as press secretary, which is basically the spokesman for the administration that has to take all the tough questions from the media. He's done his best, but Spicer really never was suited for this job from the beginning. His temperament isn't quite right for a White House that's as combative with the media as the Trump administration, because he's not very good at being combative. So for a few months now, we've been wondering whether President Trump would be letting Sean Spicer go. And in fact, that moment came when Trump appointed a new director of communications for the White House, Anthony Scaramucci.
Finally, I'd like to read a statement from the President on the resignation of Press Secretary Sean Spicer. I am grateful for Sean's work on behalf of my administration and the American people. I wish him continued success as he moves on to pursue new opportunities. Just look at his great television ratings. Sean will continue to serve the administration through August, and the President has also appointed Anthony Scaramucci as Communications Director, and I have a statement on Anthony's appointment as well. Anthony is a person I have great respect for, and he will be an important addition to this administration. He's been a great supporter and will now help implement key aspects of our agenda while leading the communications team. We have accomplished so much, and we are being given credit for so little. The good news is the people get it, even if the media doesn't.
Now, if you don't know Scaramucci, He's been involved in conservative politics, particularly in New York, for quite some time, pretty well known on the right. This is an individual who actually is not that much different from Donald Trump, someone who's made a lot of money and had a lot of success, who's pretty outspoken, not politically correct at all, and does a lot of talking with his hands, as the media pointed out. This was on display when Scaramucci did his first press conference from the White House briefing room this week.
I said during the transition, I'll say it up here, I think there's been at times a disconnect between the way we see the president and how much we love the president and the way some of you perhaps see the president. And I certainly see the American people probably see the president the way I do. But we want to get that message out there. And to use a Wall Street expression, there might be an arbitrage spread between how well we are doing and how well some of you guys think we're doing, and we're going to work hard to close that spread. But I think we're doing an amazing job. The president himself is always going to be the president. I was in the Oval Office with him earlier today, and we were talking about letting him be himself, letting him express his full identity. I think he's got some of the best political instincts in the world, and perhaps in history. If you think about it, he started his political ascent two years and 2 months ago, and he's done a phenomenal job for the American people. And the people I grew up with, they so identify with the president, and they love him, and so we're going to get that message out.
And though Scaramucci isn't going to be the press secretary going forward, that job has gone to Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who's been doing a lot of filling in for Spicer over the last couple of weeks, which is really what prompted the speculation about Spicer's potential departure from the beginning. But Scaramucci couldn't be more different from both Sean Spicer and Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Scaramucci is a smooth talker, sometimes a rough talker, and is pretty quick on his feet. A lot like President Trump, Scaramucci is able to deliver something that the audience doesn't want to hear, but charm their pants off while doing it.
Does he know what you said about him back in 2015 when you said he was a hack politician?
He brings it up every 15 seconds, okay? One of the biggest mistakes that I made, because I was an unexperienced person in the world of politics, I was supporting another candidate, I should have never said that about him. So, Mr. President, if you're listening, I personally apologize for the 50th time for saying that.
So the media got pretty excited about these changes this week, and that's understandable because nothing attracts the attention of the mainstream media more than a story that's connected to the mainstream media. And in that context, the story really didn't disappoint. The reason that the palace intrigue Game of Thrones style story stayed in the headlines all week isn't just because the media is obsessed with it, isn't just because the media is obsessed with itself, but because it came with more twists and turns than an episode of Game of Thrones. Shortly after Scaramucci took his position as the director of communications, he did something very unusual. From what we know, Anthony Scaramucci placed a phone call to a reporter named Ryan Lizza, who works at The New Yorker. What he wanted to talk about were his coworkers, and particularly Reince Priebus, the White House chief of staff, and Steve Bannon, one of the president's most controversial counselors. And this was a conversation we could have never anticipated. If all the reporting is true, and nobody's really disputing that it is, Scaramucci unloaded his feelings about his colleagues in what can only be described as a rant to Ryan Lizza that ranged from the critical to the threatening to the purely crude.
A newly published bombshell conversation in which the White House communications director launches a profane attack against the White House chief of staff. This is a remarkable development. I want to bring in Ryan Lizza, the New Yorker.
Yeah, well, so look, it's no secret that Anthony Scaramucci has been on a campaign against people leaking at the White House. And so last night, I reported in, frankly, a tweet, I didn't even think it was that important to write an article about it, that the president was having dinner with Sean Hannity and Scaramucci and some other folks. Scaramucci came out of that dinner, saw that report, and called me because he wanted to know who told me about the dinner. And he was really upset that the dinner and the participants in the dinner leaked, and so that's what this. That's how this interview started.
Let's go, because I've now read, what you wrote, and I want you to read for our viewers some of these rather profane comments that Anthony Scaramucci made to you in this phone conversation.
He starts off with Reince is a expletive, paranoid schizophrenic, a paranoiac. He believed that Priebus leaked this to me, right? So he was channeling Priebus in this quote. He says, "Oh, Bill Shine." Bill Shine is a Fox News executive who was at the dinner last night, and he's sort of getting into the head of what he believes Priebus is here.
Former Fox
News executive. He says, "Oh, Bill Shine is coming. Let me leak the expletive thing and see if I can expletive block these people."
And it wasn't just Reince Priebus that he unleashed against. It was Steve Bannon.
Yeah. He said, "I'm not Steve Bannon. I'm not trying to, few expletives there that you can see on your screen. I'm not trying to build my own brand of the expletive strength of the president. I'm here to serve the country."
Now, one of the main reasons this happened is because Scaramucci has had one main focus as he starts his new job, and that is to track down and put a stop to the White House leakers, these people who have been leaking information about the inner workings of the White House to the press since the beginning of the Trump administration at a level that we really have never seen before in American history. Leaking is always something that happens in politics. This is something that political operatives do in order to get the press talking about an issue they want them to cover. It's something they do in order to get a political advantage over a colleague or a political opponent. And it's something to be expected in America or anywhere else. Except since Trump has taken office, those leaks have been ratcheted up to a new level. Just about everything is leaked to the press, including information that is not only classified, but stories that are factually inaccurate and put the national security of the country in jeopardy, which is why sharing this type of information, often classified information, is a crime. And so Scaramucci has vowed to find these people, fire these people, and if necessary, prosecute these people who are leaking information from within the West Wing. And in his rant to Ryan Lizza, he focuses directly on the White House Chief of Staff, Reince Priebus, who has been a pretty quiet member of the Trump administration since they took office in January, but nonetheless a controversial figure. That's because Priebus was really not part of the Trump train from the beginning. Priebus, in his previous position, was the chairman of the Republican National Committee. And all during the primaries for the 2016 election, Priebus had to remain fairly neutral because the GOP had, at its start, 17 different candidates running for office, and by nature, the chair of the party is supposed to stay neutral until a nominee is selected. Priebus truly did stay neutral, much to the dismay of a lot of establishment Republicans who really wanted to see the chairman of their party help them stop this phenomenon of Donald Trump from winning the primaries. And when that didn't happen, and Trump became the nominee, Priebus threw his support behind his party's nominee, as one should. And not only did he support Donald Trump, but Priebus played a very important role in what would be Trump's victory in November. You see, that's because the Republican Party really fell behind in the technology game. Because one thing President Obama and the folks who helped him get elected really had over the Republicans was their embrace of a new form of campaigning and fundraising on the internet. Obama and his supporters, which included folks who were behind the founding of Facebook and other Silicon Valley giants, they used social media to reach a much broader group of donors, small donors, $20 or so, to raise a tremendous amount of money and also to control the narrative of the election in a way that proved very successful 2 times. But since those defeats, Reince Priebus, as the chairman of the RNC, has put a lot of investment into modernizing the Republican Party's technology and data game. And he did a great job. By the time 2016 came around, the Republican Party had a great data operation and was ready to compete on that level with the Democrats. And a good thing, because Hillary Clinton not only inherited those strategies and that data from the Democratic Party, but had the money, upward of $1 billion, to invest in furthering that operation and improving it in her bid for the White House. So when you take this enhanced data operation that Priebus had been building at the RNC, and you combine that with the strategy that Jared Kushner spearheaded, bringing in groups that were responsible for the micro-targeting that happened in the Brexit campaign in the UK and in some other surprising election results, Trump entered the 2016 general election with a tremendous arsenal of technological tools that allowed him to compete on the level of Hillary Clinton and the Democrats in a way Republicans hadn't before. So Priebus really did contribute quite a bit to the election of Donald Trump, and once Trump won the election and it was time for him to pick his team, the president decided to appoint Reince Priebus as his chief of staff. The chief of staff being the position that is, as the name suggests, in charge of all of the staff and operations that take place in the West Wing of the White House. And this was a move that disappointed some of the more populist Trump Republicans. They wanted to see somebody who was an outsider like the president, but even those folks understood the reason that Trump made this selection. You see, you have to put yourself back in the mindset of January 2017. This is before the spectacle that we're witnessing now really got underway, before Trump took office, before the Russia hysteria, and so many other runaway stories, and before we really got to see which side various Republicans, media outlets, and political staffers were on. What Trump was thinking about at the time was bringing the party together, was unifying the Republican Party and beginning to reach out to folks who were either unsure about the new president or hadn't voted for him. What he wanted to do was bring together various factions so that he could govern as president. And so choosing Reince Priebus as the chief of staff was, in a sense, a gesture in that direction. He picked the party guy, the head of the Republican Party establishment. And so strategically, we can see how that made sense. And in fact, that was also why Sean Spicer got his position. You see, Sean Spicer was the communications head of the Republican Party. He was the spokesman for Reince Priebus's RNC. And really, the two came in as a package deal. But it didn't take long to see that Spicer and Priebus were not a good cultural fit for the White House staff. And that's why we started to get these stories early on, that there were folks who had direct access to the president that circumvented the authority of Priebus as chief of staff. Not only did we have these tales of competition between Priebus and Steve Bannon, who's championing this nationalism and populism aspect of the Trump agenda, but we heard how Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law and a counselor to the president, had a direct line of communication around Priebus, how Ivanka, Kushner's husband and the president's daughter, had the same. And almost from the get-go, there's been discussion as to whether or not Priebus was an effective chief of staff or was even given the authority he would need to be effective in the first place. Well, we found out the answer to that when Scaramucci took his role as director of communications, and it was immediately announced that Scaramucci would not report to Priebus, but instead would directly report to the president, which is fairly unusual. That's because, once again, as chief of staff, all staff would normally report to Priebus and then Priebus to the president. Well, Scaramucci wasn't going to have that setup, and in his rant to Ryan Lizza at The New Yorker, we found out that not only was the organizational chart a bit unusual, but Scaramucci had some pretty strong criticism of Priebus himself. The conversation was pretty harsh. Scaramucci said that Priebus was paranoid and a schizophrenic, and possibly a leaker, and challenged Reince Priebus to prove that he wasn't a leaker, kind of calling him out on the carpet and suggesting that he and perhaps the president didn't have confidence in Reince Priebus in his role. And so all of this was a bit too much for the mainstream media to handle. They reported it all at face value and began this narrative of palace intrigue that became the New York Post cover about Survivor and who would survive the elimination in the White House. And that answer came pretty quickly.
This is CNN Breaking News.
I'm Wolf Blitzer in the Situation Room. We're following breaking news tonight. The biggest shakeup yet in the tumultuous Trump White House. The White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus forced out and replaced now by the current Homeland Security Secretary, retired Marine Corps General John Kelly. President Trump making the announcement on Twitter just about an hour or so ago as he returned from an event in New York out on Long Island aboard Air Force One. Source close to Reince Priebus tells CNN that he privately resigned actually yesterday as his feud with the new communications director, Anthony Scaramucci, exploded. Scaramucci publicly accusing Reince Priebus of leaking information and launching a profanity-laced rant against him, all apparently with the president's blessing.
The president chose as his replacement retired General John Kelly, who'd been serving as Secretary of Homeland Security and doing, by all accounts, a pretty great job at that. He was Trump's pick to replace Reince Priebus at the top spot in the White House. That's something that the rumor mill has been saying the president wanted to do for some time now. That he had been so impressed with General Kelly's performance at DHS that he had suggested to his closest advisors that if the chief of staff position were to open up, if Reince Priebus were to leave that role, that Kelly would be his choice to replace him. Well, he got that chance this week, and it leads us to question whether or not this story, whether or not the rant from Scaramucci and the palace intrigue, the Game of Thrones, should be taken at face value as the media has been. The reason is because there's some pretty inexplicable elements to this story. Most notably, Anthony Scaramucci, a pretty seasoned political operative, and someone used to dealing with the media, who is in fact the White House communications director now, in one of his first moves as communications director, contacts a reporter and unloads a profanity-filled rant about his colleagues, some of the top Trump administration officials. And then, when asked why he did that, tweets that he made the mistake of trusting a reporter, which he wouldn't do again. Now, this doesn't really make any sense if you think about it. Scaramucci calls a reporter, not just any reporter, but Ryan Lizza, a New York City elitist reporter at The New Yorker, of all places. Not exactly Trump country. Not a lot of Trump voters subscribing to The New Yorker. But nonetheless, Scaramucci calls Ryan Lizza and gives him this interview, or gives him this material that anyone could see would be like crack to the mainstream media. Almost makes you wonder if Scaramucci, in fact, wanted this story to be reported as it has been. Why would he do that? Well, if Scaramucci's role is to flush out and deal with the leakers inside the administration, if his role is to be the president's media hitman or enforcer, so to speak, then what he's doing here, through Ryan Lizza, through the media, is calling out his colleagues without exception, from the lowest level staffers to the top guys, and saying, if you're not with the president, if your focus isn't to put forward his agenda, as mine is, then I will find you, I will call you out, and your position does not keep you safe, no matter how high level it is. Nobody was safe here. Not Priebus, not Bannon, certainly not Bannon. And in fact, it seems that that message was received, because Priebus took the opportunity to exit while he could. And he exited positively.
Reince is a good man. John Kelly will do a fantastic job. General Kelly has been a star, done an incredible job thus far, respected by everybody. A great, great American. Reince Priebus, a good man. Thank you very much.
Now on to another story of palace intrigue that started unfolding last week. You'll remember we talked about Attorney General Jeff Sessions and some of the comments that President Trump made about his Attorney General, expressing his disappointment in the job Sessions has been doing so far. You remember that Sessions recused himself from the Russia investigation, which up until now has been one of the more important things under the purview of the Justice Department. And that's led Trump to be pretty critical of Sessions, one of his earliest supporters and friends in government, saying that Sessions has been a weak and beleaguered attorney general and causing the media to speculate whether or not Sessions had lost the confidence of the president and would perhaps be resigning. But we got an answer from Sessions himself this week. He did an interview with Tucker Carlson on Fox News, and in speaking out about this, he said that the comments from the president had been hurtful, had hurt his feelings.
Mr. General, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
You've seen the president's criticism of you. Do you think it's fair?
Well, it's kind of hurtful, but the President of the United States is a strong leader. He is determined to move this country in the direction he believes it needs to go to make us great again. And he has had a lot of criticisms, and he's steadfastly determined to get his job done, and he wants all of us to do our jobs, and that's what I intend to do.
So far from firing back at the president or leaving his post as Attorney General, Sessions seems to be putting his head down and keeping his eyes on the prize, which is implementing the law and order policies put forward by Trump that, in many ways, got the president elected. And this week, that agenda was focused on combating a brutal gang in America called MS-13.
Our hearts and our nation grieve for the victims and their families since January 16. Think of this. MS-13 gang members have brutally murdered 17 beautiful young lives in this area on Long Island alone. Think of it. They butchered those little girls. They kidnap, they extort, they rape, and they rob. They prey on children. They shouldn't be here. They stomp on their victims. They beat them with clubs. They slash them with machetes. And they stab them with knives. They have transformed peaceful parks and beautiful, quiet neighborhoods into blood-stained killing fields. They're animals.
Now, if you haven't heard of MS-13, this is an organized crime operation, a domestic terror group, as described by some, that originated in South America and in El Salvador, but has infiltrated the United States through Mexico, crossing the U.S. southern border. There's estimated 10,000 MS-13 gang members in America and in 42 states. Some have likened MS-13 to ISIS and the Taliban because, in effect, they operate the same way here in America. The vast majority being illegal aliens in this country, they target immigrant communities, particularly those who are here illegally, who feel as though perhaps they're under threat of deportation or are not part of the community or culture where they live. And these become the new recruits for MS-13 in their violent criminal operation that is so dangerous that MS-13 has become a popular hire for the Mexican drug cartel, Sinaloa. You remember El Chapo's organization. They hire MS-13 to be their enforcers, to be their hitmen. So in 42 states in America, we have this heinous gang wreaking havoc on not only their own communities, but others as well. And this week, we heard from the Trump administration doubling down on their pledge to eliminate MS-13 from the United States. So Jeff Sessions went down to South America, to El Salvador, to meet with his counterparts there, to try to deal with the problem at the source, but also presumably to work with the government there in advance of what is likely to be a mass deportation of criminal elements from the United States back to their home country, attempting to set up a plan so that these folks will not be coming back. But the mainstream media saw the story differently, particularly on CNN.
MS-13 is one of the most violent gangs in America. The FBI says there's been a surge in MS-13 activity and recruitment in the last 2 years. We wanted to know what leads some young people to join MS-13.
They feel like they could do whatever they want because Trump himself has made everybody fear. All the immigrants, they feel like if they go to the police or something, they get deported. Because what Trump is saying that all the Hispanics are bad and everything, so like whatever happens to them, they rather stay quiet and let it happen.
This gives them the opportunity to tell immigrants, what are you gonna do? Are you going to report us? Look, they're deporting other innocent people. They're going to accuse you. They're going to associate you with us.
Things took a somewhat bizarre turn, with CNN seeking out interviews with members of the MS-13 gang and giving them a platform to talk about how Trump's rhetoric in targeting the MS-13 gang is actually emboldening the gang, making them stronger, and giving them a better ability to recruit new members who feel under assault from the Trump administration and its threats of deportation. So we have violent murders of teenagers happening in otherwise quiet communities in America, and CNN feels that good reporting involves interviewing these heinous gang members and giving voice to their criticisms of the President of the United States in order to suggest that perhaps his policies to eliminate this gang are in fact the problem. This kind of down the rabbit hole reasoning that so often comes from CNN, among others, really shows where their priorities are. Some went so far as to suggest that when the president uses language like calling these gang members, these brutal, violent gang members, animals, that he is in fact demonizing and dehumanizing all immigrants, all Hispanic people, and is the source of the problem. It's so ridiculous, it's almost hard to believe that it passes as news. But these are the kind of acrobatics that make CNN the biggest act in the media circus. So the story this week that is most likely to affect the daily lives of real Americans was the ultimate failure of the Republican Party to pass legislation that would repeal and replace Obamacare, as they've been promising. It all came to a head this week when the Republicans, unable to get a consensus within their own party around any coherent healthcare plan as a replacement, decided the best thing to do right now would be to at least get Obamacare repealed. What this means is they will pass a limited bill that does nothing but overturn the laws that make up Obamacare. In other words, take the system that President Obama and the Democrats created to take those laws and rip them out at the roots, returning us, in essence, to what we had prior to the passage of the Affordable Care Act. The thinking here is that because the Republican Party can't agree on what the replacement will be just yet, and because the Democrats are only interested in voting no and not contributing any ideas that they might be able to vote yes on, they would use what they called this skinny bill to repeal the law and then spend their time working as a party and perhaps across the aisle with the Democrats on a new replacement. This was a last-ditch effort to erase Obamacare from history, and they failed. They failed because of one person, because of one senator.
The Republican effort to repeal the Affordable Care Act has failed. Arizona Senator John McCain helped sink the effort along with Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski. It all played out in dramatic fashion overnight.
Mr. McCain.
You can hear some senators' applause at the end there as Senator McCain gives a dramatic thumbs down signal. Nancy, what a night.
It was unbelievable, Mag. You know, I've seen a lot of dramatic moments here on Capitol Hill over the years, but nothing that played out quite like this.
Ironically, it's John McCain's state, Arizona, where people have been affected in some of the worst ways by Obamacare's failures. Arizonans have seen a dramatic increase in their premiums. Over 100% increase in how much their healthcare plans cost under Obamacare. And they've seen their choices on the healthcare marketplace disappear. So since Obamacare requires every American citizen to buy this healthcare or be penalized, you've got Arizonans and people all over the country choosing between paying for healthcare plans they can't afford or getting penalized on their taxes by the government. And yet John McCain decided the best thing to do would be to keep Obamacare, and the legacy of President Obama, the man who defeated him in 2008 for the presidency, to keep that legacy in place. In essence, eliminating the Republicans' hope of returning to this place in which repeal of Obamacare is possible.
In the end, it was just 3 Republican senators who voted against health care reform, but it was enough to stop the bill in its tracks. Now the GOP faces a reckoning with an embarrassing failure in Congress and a failing presidency. Do you want to know what failure looks like? Just take a look at the last 36 hours of the Trump presidency.
And now it's time to take a look at a story that's become quite a sideshow in the media circus this week, when President Trump surprised us all by tweeting a new policy for the U.S. military.
President Trump officially reversing Obama policy and not allowing transgendered individuals into the U.S. military.
Well, the decision took many people by surprise here in Washington, many people at the Pentagon by surprise. It came via Twitter this morning, the president tweeting, after consultation with my generals and military experts, please be advised that the United States government will not accept or allow transgender individuals to serve in any capacity in the U.S. military. Our military must be focused on decisive and overwhelming victory and cannot be burdened with the tremendous medical costs and disruption that transgender in the military would entail.
And with that statement, reporters and commentators on the left absolutely lost it.
Here we are, American Heroes Week, and it sounds like the president has just defined who he now believes are heroes.
Why the change? We don't really know. We know what he said. The White House says it's about readiness. Analysts say it's likely a play to his political base, leaving trans warriors no direction about their careers.
Today, a president who never served is attacking thousands of heroes who do. It's the latest effort by Donald Trump and Mike Pence to undo our progress and to drag LGBTQ people back into the closet.
According to the opposition, this new policy from President Trump is a stripping away of progress made toward LGBT rights in America and an attack on transgendered people. But is it really that? Well, in fact, it isn't. President Trump is proposing to maintain the same policy that was in effect for 7.5 years of the Obama administration. Because transgendered individuals have never been able to serve openly in the military as anything but their current biological gender. What does this mean? Well, first, let's define what we're talking about here. Transgenderism is a condition in which an individual may be born one gender, but psychologically identify, feel as if they are a member of a different gender. And in truth, we have very little understanding of that issue. There has been very little science, very few studies done that show transgenderism to be a biological reality. As far as modern science can tell us, there are still two genders, and always have been. Individuals are born with either two X chromosomes or an X and a Y, making them women or men, but not both. Gender has not been proven to be fluid, nor has it been shown that identifying as a gender other than your birth gender is a natural state. But regardless of that, this is not to suggest that transgender individuals are somehow wrong or somehow lesser as people. This is simply to say that we don't know what makes them transgender and whether or not this is something that should be encouraged and facilitated, whether by the U.S. military, by the parents of teens and young children who are now identifying as transgender, or by society at large. Indeed, I think we can all agree that if someone is transgender, if someone wishes to live as a gender other than their birth gender, that they are free in the United States of America to do so, and to do so without fear or discrimination in their private life as a citizen. But the U.S. military is not private life as a citizen. The U.S. military is something very different. And in the military, there are many policies that restrict the rights of soldiers in order to maintain a uniform, effective, and lethal fighting force, which is the military's first and only purpose: to win wars. But the Obama administration, in its final year, decided that the transgender issue is decided, that science was not important, and that individuals who identify as transgender, who may not have changed themselves physically or behaviorally, but simply feel as though they are a member of a different gender from the one in which they were born, that those individuals can serve in that capacity in the U.S. military. And in its final months, the Obama administration began producing training materials for this new policy, which has begun rolling out only in the last few weeks. And that policy says that individuals, regardless of their outward appearance, who identify as a different gender, may do so in the military without adjusting their behavior or their outward appearance in any way. In other words, a man who believes himself and identifies as a woman may serve as a woman in the military, living with women soldiers, showering with women soldiers, sleeping in the barracks with women soldiers, and that no one may question this, including the women soldiers. The mandatory sensitivity training that was now being implemented in the military, in fact, states explicitly that women soldiers must accept as normal seeing individuals in their showers and barracks that do not match their own gender. In other words, showering with people who look like men, who sound like men, who have the body parts of men, but claim to be women, is something you're just going to have to get used to. And when you consider that the estimated 6,000 transgendered individuals in the military, these are, again, not people who have transitioned, who have physically undergone a change to their gender, but who simply identify as a different gender, that 6,000 of them make up 0.5% of the overall military forces. There are 1.5 million servicemen and women who do not identify as transgender, and an estimated 6,000 who do. After hearing a lot of outcry from soldiers and military leaders, the Trump administration has decided not to pursue this change in policy that the Obama administration squeaked in its last few months in office. And though there was no outcry during the 7.5 years of the Obama administration in which this policy was in effect, as soon as President Trump announces that he will maintain those standards, commentators and reporters on the left have pounced on this issue, calling it an attack on the transgender community. Well, let's look at the realities. Being transgender typically involves a very difficult process of medical and psychological treatment, ranging from hormone therapy to gender reassignment surgery to the treatment of a condition called gender dysphoria, which is at the root of transgenderism. And so, putting aside for a moment the identity aspects of being transgender that the left almost solely focuses on, and looking at being transgender in its entirety, including the medical conditions that surround it, you realize that there is perhaps good reason why transgender individuals are not a great fit for military service. There is a list as long as your arm of medical conditions that prevent people from enlisting in the military. You see, there's no right to serve in the military. It is not a guaranteed right, and in fact, a good many people can't get into the military because of physical or mental characteristics that they possess. Here's just a few. If you are too short or too tall, you're not getting in to the military. If you have breast implants, forget it. If you have ovarian cysts, you have an abnormal pap smear, or one of your testicles hasn't descended, you are not going to be a soldier. If you've ever had an organ transplant, an STD, if you've had an injury to your penis that prevents normal urination, or you're missing a kidney, your enlistment will be denied. If you have a deformity to your skull, to your jaw, to your face, if you have neck or muscle spasms, if you have heart disease or varicose veins, you're not a fit for the U.S. military. And if you have a psychosis, a personality disorder, certain types of acne and dermatitis, plantar warts, allergies, or even sleep apnea, your service to your country will be as a civilian. So when you put that in context with what comes along with being transgender, the difficult hormonal treatments, surgical treatments, and psychological care required, and when we look at what people like Lady Gaga remind us is a high risk of suicide among transgender young people, as high as 50% suicide rate, it leads us to question, is this policy really an assault on the rights of transgendered people? Or does it make sense to break all the rules for one identity group that has a high risk of suicide and a high need of special medical accommodation? Does it make sense to equip them with weapons and put those individuals in a war zone? Is that the best battlefield policy? And finally, we take a look at a story that's remained on the fringes of the circus this week, largely unreported by the mainstream media: the strange arrest of an IT staffer that works for Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz.
Just minutes ago, Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz fired Imran Awan, a Pakistani-born IT technician who has worked with several family members to perform computer services for Wasserman Schultz and other leading Democratic lawmakers. Awan was arraigned on one count of bank fraud charges in U.S. District Court here in Washington today, following his arrest last night at Dulles International Airport prior to boarding an overseas flight. He pleaded not guilty and was released under strict monitoring. The investigation started with allegations that the Awan Group was engaged in double billing, but then reportedly expanded to include how sensitive House data was stored. The group was barred from House computer networks in February when U.S. Capitol Police identified them as suspects in a criminal investigation. The Daily Caller has reported that authorities seized smashed computer drives from Awan's residence.
Now, you may remember Debbie Wasserman Schultz as the former head of the Democratic National Committee. She's a congresswoman from Florida, most notable for her work on such hits as colluding with Hillary Clinton to screw Bernie Sanders out of the Democratic nomination. It was Debbie Wasserman Schultz's emails that took center stage when the DNC server was hacked, reportedly by the Russians, and the contents were released to WikiLeaks. In that process, we learned that Debbie wasn't just in cahoots with Hillary Clinton. She was doing everything in her power to make sure that Hillary got the nomination and carried forward the agenda of the Democratic Party establishment, of which she is a major figurehead. Well, what happened this week involving Debbie Wasserman Schultz and her IT staffer, Imran Awan, has left a lot of people scratching their heads. You see, over the last few months, Imran Awan, who was Debbie's IT guy and also did IT for a number of other Democratic congresspeople, has been under investigation by the FBI for potential fraud and theft. It seems that Awan and his brothers were paid somewhere around $4 million in taxpayer money to perform IT services for the Democratic congressmen and women, for the Democratic representatives in the DNC. And as this FBI investigation unfolded, Awan's family, his wife, his kids, fled the country, were actually detained briefly at the airport as they prepared to fly to Pakistan with tens of thousands of dollars of U.S. cash in their bags. But this week, Awan himself was detained and arrested at the airport as he attempted to fly to Pakistan after having just wired $400,000 to that country. It's unknown as of now why he was doing this or to whom he was wiring that money. But there's some strangely suspicious activity going on around this story and involving Debbie Wasserman Schultz. You see, when the FBI started investigating Awan, all the other congresspeople stopped using his IT services, stopped paying him to do their IT. All except Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Instead of firing him, Debbie decided to get involved in the investigation. Some say attempting to obstruct the investigation. You see, when the Capitol Police seized a laptop belonging to Awan, which they found hidden in the halls of Congress, Debbie herself confronted the chief of police and threatened him with consequences if he didn't return that laptop to her.
If a member loses equipment, yes, and it is found by the Capitol Police or your staff, and it is identified as that member's equipment, and the member is not associated with any case, and that is their equipment, it is supposed to be returned. Yes or no?
Depends on the circumstances, and if the circumstances are.
I don't understand how that's possible. Members' equipment is members' equipment. It is not. Under my understanding, the Capitol Police is not able to confiscate members' equipment when the member is not under investigation. It is their equipment, and it's supposed to be returned.
Well, I think there's extenuating circumstances in this case, and I think that, working through my counsel and the necessary personnel, if that in fact is the case, and with the permission of through the investigation, then we'll return the equipment. But until that's accomplished, I can't return the equipment.
I think you're violating the rules when you conduct your business that way, and should expect that there would be consequences.
This is a highly unusual move for a member of Congress, and really so far hard to understand. We lack the context. We lack any information that helps us explain why Debbie Wasserman Schultz would inject herself in this way into the police investigation of an IT staffer. And not just any IT staffer, but one that has had hard drives seized from his apartment that have been smashed with a hammer, which sounds pretty similar to other Democrat IT scandals, like Hillary Clinton's illegal email server, where they turned over her smartphones to the FBI, also smashed with a hammer. So Debbie gets involved, she threatens the police, she tries to get him to back off Awan, and still it comes to a point where he tries to flee the country. And that becomes a story that can't be ignored. Except it has been. Other than Fox News and conservative media outlets, the mainstream media has barely covered this all week. For most of the week, the combined airtime given to this story by CNN, MSNBC, CBS, and others was less than 1 minute. Some counted it at 37 seconds. The New York Times, the Washington Post, these national papers of record have barely mentioned it, if at all. Meanwhile, in conservative media, there is a desperate race to tie this story to the overall Democrat IT problems and hacking that they say was done by the Russians. You see, for a long time, the right has believed that whatever meddling Russia may have done in our election, as we all know they always do, the real action wasn't what the Russians were doing, but whatever was going on inside the Democratic Party. That what resulted in WikiLeaks getting this information and distributing it, and ultimately affecting Hillary Clinton's chances to win the election, that was an inside job. That's what they believe on the right. And that's why there's been such intense interest from the right on cases like this involving Imran Awan, and also involving things like the mysterious death of Seth Rich, who worked for the Democrats and was mysteriously gunned down on the street as he prepared to give testimony to the FBI about the hacking. Seth Rich has since been uncovered online to have been a Bernie Sanders supporter who was very upset, very disappointed with the Democratic Party officials who were colluding internally to rob Bernie Sanders of his chances at the nomination. Some have suggested that this Russia story amounts to a massive cover-up cooked up by Hillary Clinton and other Democratic Party officials to explain what happened in what amounts to a bungled election campaign involving a lot of shady activity, potentially illegal activity. And so when we have an IT staffer who had access to a lot of high-level information belonging to a lot of elected officials in Congress, including the top dog at the DNC, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, it's only natural that folks who are attempting to connect the dots here smell a story. And only as pressure mounted from those outlets has the mainstream media begun reporting it. CNN dedicated a little bit of airtime to this story at the end of the week, but ultimately that reporting downplayed the potential significance of this story, and even focused on Debbie Wasserman Schultz and her version of the story.
So we said that she has an explanation for this. Wasserman Schultz says she kept Awan employed because she was worried that he was being unfairly treated for his Pakistani heritage. She did drop him shortly after the arrest. It will likely be much harder, however, to get rid of the conspiracy theories that are erupting around this story because, you know, the right has been wanting to prove that Russia wasn't doing it, that somehow it was a problem on the Democratic side. So some have attached to this. Again, there's no proof. None. Now, as an IT guy, he may have had some access to things, but there's no proof he did anything with that on this front, but an intriguing story.
And once again, identity politics takes center stage, in effect shutting down any reporting or any interest in this story anywhere but in right-wing media. Only time will tell if this next chapter in the Democrats' IT saga proves to be something of note. And we'll keep following it, whether or not the media chooses to shine a spotlight on the story. But that's all the time we have this week. We'll be back next week with a whole new set of stories taking center stage and a look at some of the amazing acrobatics taking place on the left and the right in this media circus. I'm Anthony Rotolo, and I'm watching this news so you don't have to.